Hey all. So I tried recording this yesterday and I was just like not having any of it. I was just kind of bouncing all over the place and I wasn't properly organized. So I decided to take a break and focus on something else. And now I'm retrying this and seeing if I can get a better run through. So I decided to combine chapters 4 and 5 after looking at the content. Chapter 4 is about evolution and development. Chapter 5 is about human life history. There's a lot of overlap between these topics as the author presents it. I think there's more that could be pulled out of evolution and development, but it's not really something I want to spend a lot of time on. So I folded the things that I want to talk about in evolution and development into the human life history, and I think they'll work together pretty well. Um, in general, I feel like it makes more sense to cover them together. To be clear, the week 5 quiz will only cover chapter 5, and the week 6 quiz will cover chapters 4 and 6. So just so you guys are aware of what content is on what quiz and so on and so forth. I tried to indicate in my slides what content is coming from chapter 4 and what content is, if there's no indication, then it's coming from chapter 5. So that's just kind of like the rundown of things and what's going on. So I want to start out by talking about what is life history. And the definition of life history is the key characteristics, patterns of growth, maturation, reproduction, and mortality that defines progress through life, right? Like it's basically what an organism does, how it does it, and how its life progresses, right? Usually it's divided into like juvenile stage, adult stage, adolescent phase, geriatric phase, so on and so forth. And you kind of tell the story of how the organism is and what it does, right? So like an example, and actually when I was an undergrad, I had to do a paper, I had to do a life history paper on salmon, so I decided to use that as an example. So the example is salmon, and they're born in a stream, and they migrate to the ocean after a year or more. They spend 3 to 4 years in the ocean growing big, and then they return to the natal stream to mate one time. Like that's a really brief overview of life history of the salmon. You could get into a lot more detail, right? The reason why I particularly picked out the salmon is because if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you'll notice there's this little guy right down here, right? So this is the ocean form. This is the male sexually active form, and this is the female sexually active form. And you got this little guy down here, okay? Here it is circled, and you can see it's just this little itty bitty guy. And what that is it's known as a jack salmon, okay? And jack salmon have a slightly divergent life history pattern. They're born in a stream, just like regular salmon. They go to the ocean, and then they return after 1 year. They also have one mating event. Okay, so it's just they return much quicker, so they don't have enough time to grow as big. And it's a different life history strategy, right? And so the reason why I pulled this out is because sometimes sometimes even within an organism, they'll take different life history strategies based upon the conditions and the environmental signals that they're getting, right? And that's a concept that's known as phenotypic plasticity, okay? And so we're going to end up talking about phenotypic plasticity in a couple different ways. And as it turns out, humans are not super phenotypically plastic. We're, for the most part, pretty much, we have one life history strategy. But when you start looking at some of the, but there's some really, really interesting phenotypic plastic events in development that can cause major health outcomes later in life. So we're going to end up talking about those at a couple different points, okay? And so that's why I wanted to point that out. We're also going to pull out some more extreme examples of phenotypic plasticity from the animal kingdom because they're just kind of cool, okay? All right, so I'm going to give a super brief, super fast overview of human life history. We will get more in depth into the stages of human development and much more detailed when a little bit later in the chapter. So this is just like a really, really fast overview. I decided to set it to Shakespeare's 7 Ages of Man, just because, I don't know, I really like that piece of work by him. It's one of the only pieces of work by Shakespeare I actually enjoy. It's the famous quote, all the world's a stage and all the men and women are merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his life plays many parts, his act being 7 ages, right? And so that's where it comes from. Okay. So brief overview, humans are born following about 280 days of gestation. They have a really prolonged nutritional dependence on the mother, and there's very extensive parental care provided. Human babies are basically worthless. We'll talk about why later. Puberty hits around 10 to 14 years of age. It's almost always females first, then males. In general, humans have fairly modest sexual dimorphism. Body size, men are typically larger than women. Men have more hair than women, including more facial hair, and women develop breasts, and there's also some morphological differences in the hips. But in general, humans are not super sexually dimorphic, particularly when you compare them to like the salmon that we saw on the previous slide, or like walruses. Reproduction is delayed into the late teens to 20s usually. Generally, humans have birth to one baby at a time, although twins and triplets happen. Typically, there's strong pair binding between the mother and the father. Generally, those are monogamous relationships, but they don't have to be. There is polygynous societies out there, as well as polyandrous, but polyandry is very rare. In general, humans very much fit the idea of a K-strategist organism. Long lives, high industrial care, high survival of offspring. And even in prehistoric societies, it was estimated that close to 50% of infants made it to age 5, which is, I mean, compared to other organisms, that's really high. Humans are very K-strategists. Okay, so we're very much on that spectrum. Mental maturation is in the early to late 20s. It's really interesting that mental maturity is reached later than sexual maturity. And the book has an interesting point of view on that I don't know if I buy or not. We'll get into that. Humans have a really, really long reproductive window if you think about it in terms of the animal kingdom broadly. It's your early teens to the mid 40s for women, and for men it's the mid teens to geriatric age. Like I think it was Robert De Niro just had a baby and he's like 75. So it's a really long reproductive window. But even if you consider the standard, I mean, most reproduction occurs before the 40s. The vast majority of human offspring are born to parents who are younger than 40. But even that, a 20-year reproductive window is still a really long window. But we're a long-lived species. Most species don't live 70 years. Grant parental care is one thing that is unique in human life history strategy, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And menopause is also something that's very unique in human life history. And death. Death usually occurs in the 70s. Yeah, that's the end of it. So that's our quick overview of human life history. Okay, so there's a thing called Kleiber's Law. Kleiber's Law is interesting because it explains a couple things, right? So in most life history contexts, the organism is getting bigger in size, okay? And that requires different energy expenditures, right? Like a small organism has different energy requirements than a large organism, okay? And it should be fairly obvious to you that a large organism consumes more energy than a small organism, right? Like an elephant consumes more than a mouse does, right? But if you scale them, right, it turns out that an elephant is much more efficient in terms of energy than a mouse is, right? Basically, it takes less nutrients to sustain a kilogram of elephant than it does to sustain a kilogram of mice, okay? So there's a relationship between how much, the metabolism, the energy expenditure, and the body mass, but it's not linear, right? Yeah. So this graph is deceptive because it looks like it's linear, right? Like this is a straight line, but pay attention to the scales. You'll notice that they are not the same scales. And so basically what they did was they fit it to make it look linear, but it's not actually a linear relationship. Okay? And like I said, larger organisms are just more efficient, right? It's easier to maintain tissue than it is to build tissue as well. So even within a species, a growing organism requires more nutrients than a fully developed organism. Okay? Part of the reason why larger organisms are more energy efficient has to do with, well, the first thing is this the concept of surface area to volume ratio, right? So if you take a shape like a sphere or something like that, as it increases in size, the surface increases by a square function, whereas the volume increases by a cube function, right? And that's just because surface area is a two-dimensional measurement and volume is a three-dimensional measurement. So what that means is a larger object has more volume than proportion to the surface area, right? Like it has more surface area, but proportionally it has a different ratio. And that has a lot to do with nutrient exchange, right? So it's part of the reason why we don't have giant insects, right? Because insects don't have a respiratory tract. So they're limited in how big they can get based upon oxygen diffusion, right? One of the most profound effects of this is heat retention, right? Larger organisms are just more efficient in terms of heat retention, right? Which has an effect on metabolism. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's part of the reason why is the surface area to volume thing. And also larger organisms just have more efficient mechanisms of delivery, right? Like an elephant's heart has to work harder, but it doesn't work nearly as much harder as than a mouse heart. Like it takes a lot of energy to move blood around, but it doesn't take that much more energy to transmit more blood, right? Because once you have the structures in place, the vessels and all that stuff, adding volume really isn't that big of a deal. So in general, larger animals just tend to be more efficient. Oh, it's interesting in this graph. They have woman and man separated, which is funny because men are above the curve and women are below the curve, which actually makes sense just because we're within a species, right? Okay. So generally, when you're talking about body size, right, like there's a science of measuring body size that's known as allometry, right? And it's looking at the relationship between size and mass, right? And there's a couple different things that happen, right? Bone size has to increase faster than body weight to support it, right? So that's why the largest organisms are typically found in the ocean, right? Because if you're a terrestrial organism, you need really, really, really big bones to support all that body mass. Okay, and like dinosaurs were obviously huge, elephants are huge, woolly mammoths were huge, but they were very energetically expensive in terms of like producing that much mass. They needed a lot of calcium. Calcium is not always easy to find. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, and so it's also interesting to point out that the proportions of your body size change as your age. So when you're a baby, your head is about 33% of your body, but it's only 13% as an adult. So even though your head is getting larger, it becomes proportionally less of your body, right? I was talking about surface area to volume ratio. In general, smaller organisms have a tendency to lose heat more rapidly, okay? And because of this changes the thermodynamics, right? So it makes, if you're a homeothermic organism and you're large, it's relatively easy for you to maintain your body temperature, okay? So that's part of the reason why our elephants are more energy efficient, right? They're able to maintain that body temperature much easier, right? This is also interesting because women tend to be more sensitive to temperature change than men do, because typically women are slightly smaller than men. And so that's why, like, one of the problems that comes about this is the thermostat in an office, right? So, first off, women are just more sensitive to temperature change because they're typically smaller. But also, if you think about women's formal dress and men's formal dress just has more layers to it, like the suit coat and all that stuff. So the setting of the thermostat in the office is actually a really, really interesting conversation about society overall, where physiology intersects with society. Okay. Um, so being bigger has some advantages, right? It's easier to avoid predators. Your metabolism is more efficient, stuff like that. But it also has costs, right? Gravity affects you more. You have to have a bigger heart. You need increased diffusion area, so like increased alveoli to get all the oxygen in. Um, and you need a lot of nutrients to get big. So there's pros and cons to being bigger and larger. And it's it's generally interesting. There's three rules that I want you guys to be aware of. The first of which is what's known as Allen's rule. Okay, Allen's rule is humans in cold climates have shorter limbs relative to their trunk to preserve heat. Okay, and this is also true of other animals. Organisms who live closer to the poles tend to have shorter limbs than animals who live closer to the equators. And this is largely to facilitate heat exchange, right? Because you lose a lot of heat through your extremities. You lose a lot through your head too, but you really can't like send less blood to your head because then you die. So having shorter limbs is one mechanism to preserve heat in northern climates. The very closely related rule is Bergmann's rule, which basically states that organisms living closer to the poles tend to be larger than organisms living at the equator. And again, this is to conserve heat. This only applies to homeothermic organisms, by the way. If you're a larger organism and you're living up towards the poles, that's an evolutionary advantage because you're better able to retain heat. And if you live near the poles, retaining heat is a big deal. Okay. The last one is Thomson's rule. And Thomson's rule is basically that as you move to a colder climate, the nose gets narrower and longer. And it does this because your nose functions to warm up and humidify the air before it hits your lungs. Okay, and so does your trachea and larynx and all that stuff. But your nose helps facilitate this. So a longer nose, a longer, narrower nose, is more efficient at warming up and humidifying the air before it hits your lungs than a wider nose would be. And that is important for oxygen exchange to occur efficiently in the lungs. The last thing I'm going to say about body size generally is that if you look at like the weight of anything, like the proportion of the weight over the weight overall, right? So this is actually this is a graph of brain size, right? This is so the dot is you mass the brain weight and then you put it over the body weight, okay, on a logarithmic scale, and you get this nice linear relationship. Well, they're both log, but you get this nice linear relationship, right? And so anytime you see a deviation from this line, that's probably selection acting on it. Like, I don't know what this dot is down here, but for whatever reason, that's probably not the sharpest animal in the box. The general overall trend is as body size gets larger, so does brain size. And that should be relatively intuitive for you because like if you have a larger body size, that means you have more muscles. More muscles require more neurons. More neurons means you have to have a bigger brain to run it all, right? So that's the general relationship. But any deviation above and below this line indicates some type of selective pressure. And you can see humans are quite a bit above this line, okay? So that means that there's been an evolutionary selective pressure for us to have bigger brains, right? And you can do this for any organ too. You could also look at like heart size, lung size, all these different things and see if there's been selection to make it, bigger or smaller. There can be selection in either direction. So Developmental plasticity, as I said, is one of the concepts that's covered very heavily in Chapter 4, and it's a really important concept. And like developmental plasticity can change a lot of different things about an organism's body size, body shape, metabolic activity, all those different things. So it all connects to everything we talked about previously. The basic idea is that early life processes will influence phenotype throughout life and later in life, okay? So if you think about development, it's almost always, the best way to think of it is a pathway, right? Like you're moving down a developmental pathway, and every now and then there's forks in that pathway. And in that developmental pathway, you can go to right, you can go left, maybe there's 3 different options depending upon the species. But that fork is a developmental window, right? So like the organism has to make decisions at that window and try to predict future outcomes, okay? And that's basically developmental plasticity, right? It's, I forget who the father of it was, but he basically described it as like a marble rolling down a hill, right? So like it starts out at this, point right here where it can become anything, right? And it can go this way or it can go this way, right? If it goes this way, it's really hard for it to go over here to the green or the pink, right? Because now there's this ridge kind of differentiating it. So it's likely going to end up where this purple ball is. The marble doesn't roll back up the hill, okay? This is talking about induced pluripotent stem cells. Like this doesn't happen naturally in biology, right? This marble can't go back up the hill. It's always going to go down the hill. So this marble right here is stuck over here, okay? The same sense right here, if you follow the blue one, it could end up where the green one is, or it could end up where the pink one is, okay? And that just depends upon what specific routes it takes, which is based upon the information presented to it. And at least in placental mammals, that information is the mother. Like the mother is providing all information to the fetus, and the fetus has to make decisions based on that. So when you talk about developmental plasticity, the book talks about three different things, right? One of which is things that go very badly, right? And they're not evolutionary advantageous, and they're not things that are heritable, so they're beyond the scope of this course. So we don't talk about those at all. But there are challenges that must be overcome, and then there's opportunities, and those are 2 very different things, okay? And so I'm going to start with some animal examples before we start talking about human examples. So an example in animals, if you click this link, there's a video, and it goes to a National Geographic, and there's these frog eggs on a leaf, and a snake comes and starts eating them. And the snake will start to shake the eggs, and that's a cue to the eggs near it that there's a snake who's going to eat them. And the eggs make the decision. They decide to hatch early. Now, there's definitely costs with hatching early, right? Like if you're not fully developed, you're more likely to be eaten. But it's better to take that risk than the certain death of a snake eating you, right? So that's a challenge that must be overcome. The second of which is opportunities, right? This image in the lower right-hand corner is some tadpoles, and if I remember correctly, Rick Rila at University of Pittsburgh did a lot of this research. Andy C. did a lot of this research. I think he was at UC Davis. And then also, I know Barney Lutbag has done some work with this at Oklahoma State, and I knew Barney pretty well in graduate school. But basically, they found out that with certain types of tadpoles, right, there's this predator, and the predator is a dragonfly larva. And in the presence of the predator, the tadpoles will develop into this cannibalistic morph, when they'll actually eat their own. But it's bigger, it's more aggressive, better able to defend itself from a predator is like the key outcomes. But it also turns out to be cannibalistic, right? Like it's trying to take advantage of more resources. It needs more resources in order to grow bigger, right? And there's a lot of stuff about that. But if there's no predator found, it'll take this typical morph, which grows more rapidly. So this allows for more rapid development. So that's trying to take advantage of a situation, okay? The book talks about locusts. And so locusts have 2 different morphs as well, right? There's a solitary morph and there's the nomadic morph that like swarms. Okay, so these are the plagues of locusts that they talk about, where they like come and destroy entire crops, and there's thousands and thousands of them. And depending upon environmental conditions, if environmental conditions are good, the mother inserts cues into the egg that say, hey, times are good, you don't need to swarm, you don't need to migrate, just chill out where you are, there's plenty of food. But if times are bad, then they need to leave, right? And so they tend to swarm. Okay, so like based upon the environmental conditions that are present for it, these are different opportunities that can be exploited, right? Different developmental pathways. Now, these are pretty extreme developmental pathways, like much more extreme than what happens in humans. But humans also have some of this stuff going on. Nope. So, if we're talking about humans, challenges that must be overcome typically fall into one of two things. It's some kind of nutrients being limited. It's usually oxygen, or it's just nutrient in general. If you have reduced oxygen supply, the body's going to emphasize brain and heart development, right? And it's going to have to make sacrifices of other things, right? And the same basic thing happens with nutrition, right? Like if you don't have enough food, it's going to emphasize brain development and heart development because those two things are necessary to survive, right? And in both of these situations, you tend to have reduced fetal birth weight, okay? And so what the body tends to do is it'll sacrifice kidney development, which causes an increased risk of hypertension. It'll also sacrifice pancreas beta cell production, which has an increased risk of diabetes. And then last but not least, decreased skeletal muscle development, which just generally less muscle mass is a disadvantage in basically every species. You want to be as big and strong as you can, right? And so this graph actually shows, if you look at, these aren't like exact numbers, they're just showing the general relationship, right? So if the mother is very poorly nourished, you actually have increased risk of insulin resistance, which is diabetes, right? And a slight increased risk of obesity. But if the mother also eats too much, then you have an increased risk for both factors quite a bit. And you can see that there's this U-shaped relationship where optimal is the best. And, like I said, the fetus is making decisions about the environment based upon what the mother is giving it, right? And the unfortunate thing is that's not always perfect information, right? Because things like preeclampsia can happen, or like a malaria infection, which will decrease oxygen supply or decrease nutrient availability. But that's not really something that's not really a good indication of the environment overall, right? It's just kind of a thing that happened to the mother. So it's the fidelity of the information that the mother is giving to the fetus is not always perfect. It's a really complicated interplay. You think about opportunities, like I said, the mother is passing along information. Nutrient availability is something that the fetus will take into account. And I'm not talking about in terms of like, not to the point where the fetus's life is at risk, right? It's more or less to the point that there's different nutrient availability. Like the fetus will be able to develop everything it wants, but based upon how much nutrients it's getting, that provides information. Is there a lot of resources in the environment, or is there not a lot of resources in this environment? If the mother's stress levels are really high, that tends to indicate a very unstable environment where there's lots of pressures and lots of competition and things are really hard. So that might have different developmental outcomes. Like there might be better, you might want to take a different strategy if it's a really stressful environment versus a really good environment, right? And so there's some really interesting things that can happen with this. Oh. Okay. So keeping all that in mind, we're to consider life history broadly, right? So anytime you have, different life history strategies, there's this trade-off that occurs, okay? There's this concept in business called opportunity cost. And the basic idea is if you have $100, right, and you invest, you can put it in company A or company B, right? And you decide to go with company A, right? Then whatever you would have gotten from company B is what's known as your opportunity cost, right? Because you, by putting all your money in company A, you lost any opportunity from company B, okay? And now hopefully company A pays out more than company B over the long run, but you still lost the opportunity to invest in company B, right? And this is, although the concept is generally talked about in business, it's applicable to more broad things. The graph at the lower right is actually about studying, right? So like if you decide to spend 2 more hours studying, that means you have 2 less hours of fun time, right? Or 2 hours less of sleeping time, right? Like you have to work, you have to sleep, you have to have fun. Well, you don't have to have fun. But there's trade-offs, right? And like there's pros and cons to using each one of these things in different ways. Time is a resource, right? So broadly in biology, we tend to talk about resources vaguely. And oftentimes these are nutritional resources or energetic resources, but it could also be time resources or actual resources, right? And so there's differing numbers. There's lots of different things that you can, there's lots of different decisions that an organism makes that are differential investments, right? So if you think about the number of offspring or the size or the sex ratio of offsprings, how big an organism is at maturity and at birth, right? Those are 2 different life history trade-offs. There's different patterns of growth, the age at sexual maturity, parental investment is a trade-off that organisms have to decide upon. And then you also have this idea of investment in cellular repair versus maintenance, right? So you can just maintain your cells and kind of let them slowly die, or you can invest in repairing them for a longer life, right? And all these things are different trade-offs, right? So if you think about it, you know, the number of offspring that an organism produces is one that we talked about quite a bit. This is the R versus the K strategist, right? You can either have a lot of offspring and very few survive, or you can have a few offspring and most of them survive. So like this, to give you an idea, like this is data from birds, right? So this is 5,290 species of land birds, right? And you can see the vast majority of them fall between 1 and 14 eggs, right, in their clutch size. Apparently there's 6 that have greater than 14. But most of them have 3 to 4, right? Like the vast majority have somewhere between 3, 4, or 5 eggs, okay? And so that represents an evolutionary trade-off where birds, as relatively K strategist species, have decided to invest in, a fairly modest clutch size and hope that they live for, hope that most of them live. This is, if you were to do the same study on fish or spiders, the center of the graph would be in the thousands, right? And if you think about humans have a tendency to be very K strategists. So like most humans have, 2.2 kids in the United States. I should look that up. The number's changed. It's going down. But most people, the United States is very slowly growing in population. It's staying about the same overall. Interestingly enough, like the number of offspring per clutch is often something that can be studied as well, right? Like, do the birds lay one egg at a time, 3 eggs at a time, 4 eggs at a time, 6 eggs at a time? Do they do this every year? Do they do this once in their lifetime, right? Like those are different things. So it's not just the number of offspring totally, it's like when you time them out and how often you have them, right? But if you look, you can see twins are becoming more common in the United States. And a lot of this is probably driven by in vitro fertilization because IVF makes twins more common. But even back in the 1980s, that trend was going up. And so I don't know, maybe this is an evolutionary trend that's happening where reproductive fitness is optimal to have more, okay? So as I was saying, the number of offspring that you have, right, is also like per individual birth, right? Like per clutch, that's what that's called, is also a choice that offspring make, right? Like, do you have one baby at a time, two babies at a time, three babies at a time, four babies at a time, right? And in humans, it's most common to have one baby at a time, singleton birth, right? But twins and triplets happen too. And so, like, in general, you'll notice single babies are almost always larger than twins or triplets, right? And that's because there's a finite amount of resources that the mother can provide. And so as you have lighter babies, there's increased mortality, right? So this is birth weight versus survival to 4 weeks. And you can see if you get below this number right here, 6, you start to see dropped off survival rates, right? Like right here, this is about 90%. So 5 pounds is about 90%. Here it goes down to 70%, right? Oh, and female babies are more likely to survive at every birth weight, which is interesting as well. Sorry. Last thing we're going to talk about is, in terms of offspring, is the sex of the offspring. Right? So, like, males and females have different expected reproductive outcomes. We'll talk about why later. I can't remember if it's in this chapter or next, but we're definitely going to talk about this topic, right? Like, male and female babies are different from each other, right? And if you don't think that a mother can change the sex of their offspring, there actually is some evidence from the animal kingdom. So this is a paper done in Anolis carolinensis, and I highlighted 2 parts. So this first part, as is the case just after they are laid, yolk T is higher in male than female oviduct eggs. So this is, we suggest that maternally derived yolk testosterone levels could influence sex by differentially affecting male and female inducing sperm. So this author right here, Matt Laverne, is actually saying that female lizards differentially allocate testosterone to eggs, and they do this to try to skew their sex ratio one way or another based upon environmental conditions, right? And there's also some correlational evidence from humans that during good times and bad times, the sex ratio can change. And so we'll talk about this. It's known as Bateman's principle, and it's covered in chapter 8, which I think is about reproduction. But this is something to keep in mind. Also, this guy right here was my advisor in graduate school. So this is actually research I'm pretty intimately familiar with. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but like, do you invest in reproduction now, or do you invest in reproduction down the line, right? Do you put it all in on one massive reproductive event, or do you have multiple reproductive events spread out over many years? So this one right here is, I don't know what her name is, but she had 69 kids, right? 27 different births. She gave birth to 16 pairs of twins, 7 triplets, and 4 quadruplets. I didn't verify this. I found it on the internet, so it must be true, but I just thought I would share. Like, this is the extreme of human reproductive potential, is 69 children, apparently. Okay? We've talked about salmon. Salmon have one reproductive event. They put all their eggs in one basket, quite literally. Another example is the American eel. The American eel actually does the exact opposite of the salmon. They grow and develop in freshwater. When they're sexually mature, they go to this area called the Saragossa Sea. They lay their eggs and then they die. And then the little bitty baby eels will swim back up to streams and rivers in North America. So it's the exact opposite of salmon, but I didn't want to use salmon again as an example because I feel like I talk about them too much. Trade-off that organisms must consider is the age versus size of reproduction at maturity, right? So what age do you reach sexual maturity? How big are you at sexual maturity? Do you allocate your energy into reproduction, or do you allocate your energy into growth? So if you think about it, reproduction is very expensive. Like, you have to acquire a mate, which requires you to go out and find them, which increases your risk of predation. You have to produce the actual gametes. Everybody says sperm are cheap, but like, if you produce millions of them, they become expensive, right? Eggs are expensive, obviously, because they're big old honking cells. right? And then also any kind of parental care that you engage in afterwards. Engaging in sex itself is a risky behavior because you have two organisms in the same area. They're focused on each other. They're largely distracted. They tend to be making noise, energy expenditure. Some organisms have to be together for a prolonged period of times, which makes them vulnerable, right? So, like, reproduction is a very, very expensive activity. And so, a really simple demonstration of this is they took some lizards. I think these are Anolis lizards. I don't remember. But basically, what they did was they either OVX means ovary optimized, right? So they basically spayed them, right? So these are sterile lizards. And then they compared them to sham treated, which they pretend to OVX them, but they left the ovaries intact. And you do that because you want to make sure that the treatment isn't what's causing the differences you're seeing, right? Would have been nice to have a third treatment that was unmanipulated, but this sets up a nice t-test and a nice clean story. And you can see the OVX organisms survive at a higher rate than the sham treated. They have more stored energy. They have a better immune system. And they have hemocrit is something to do with blood, right? So like removing of the ovaries increased survival of these lizards in several very important categories, but obviously reduces the reproductive success. So like reproduction is a cost, and just like keep that in common. Another Anolis example, and I swear I'm not trying to pick out Anola examples, they just tend to be the ones that are easiest for me to find. This is an example like how big are you at maturity, right? So like body size is important for the ability to be reproductively successful. Larger females are able to produce healthier offspring, right? They have more energy available to allocate. Larger males are generally better at being competitive in terms of acquiring mates, right? And so, but it's not exactly the same pressures, right? Males tend to have more of a selective pressure to be larger than females do. And part of this is because female reproductive success overall is more even, right? Like, if you measure the reproductive success of females, it tends to be just less variable. Whereas in the animal kingdom, males tend to have, there's very few males that are extremely reproductively successful, right? So how big do you get? Do you put more energy into growing larger in the hopes of acquiring more mates and better mates? Or do you just try to get whatever reproduction you can get? Okay, and so those are trade-offs that organisms have to decide upon and make. And so some of these choices are actually influenced by the external environment, right? So you have external versus intrinsic mortality, right? So external is something you can't control at all. The book uses this example of lightning striking an island, right? So you imagine a small island and there's a lot of lightning that hits it. The risk of the lightning strike killing you is extrinsic mortality. You can't do anything about it. If you get struck by lightning and die, you get struck by lightning and die. So if that risk is very high, you want to rush reproduction. You want to try to get any reproductive success you can as rapidly as you can, which pushes you towards being an R strategist, right? So in general, R strategists tend to do better under unstable, chaotic environments. If there's a very low risk of the lightning hitting you and killing you, then there's no reason to rush reproduction. You may as well wait until your body is big enough, strong enough, and ready to do it. Okay, so that kind of determines the R versus K strategist, is this risk of extrinsic mortality. Intrinsic mortality is something that you do have control over. How much energy do you put towards your immune system, right? If you put a lot of energy towards maintaining your immune system and building up your, fighting cancer and stuff like that, you're going to have a longer life, but that's less energy that you can put towards reproduction. So everything is a trade-off, right? So let's take a more detailed look at human lifespan and human development, which keep in mind, human development is a course that's taught at most universities. in both a psychology and a biology context. So like this could be an entire discipline. So we're gonna like there's a lot more you can go into, right? In general, when you look at humans, um, humans wait a long time to reproduce, and that generally indicates that there was low extrinsic mortality, even in prehistoric times, right? And there definitely is low extrinsic mortality now, right? We have a lot of emphasis on somatic cell maintenance as opposed to other organisms, which indicates that like we're very much in the case strategist, right? Very prolonged reproduction time, and it's a very slow senescence. 70 years of life is a long time to live. Well, I say that at 38. It's important to keep in mind that aging and senescence are not the same thing. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Senescence is a biological process where there's a decline, following some kind of peak, right? Interesting fact: the oldest person was Jean Calment, who was 122 years old at birth. Something interesting: her life expectancy at birth was 46 years, and it was 82 years at her death. So following conception, the initial phase is focused on embryogenesis, right? Which takes up like the first month, right? So for the first month, you're basically just a clump of cells that are trying to get anchored into the placenta, right? And you go from 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32, again and again and again. And this original phase is basically focused on organizing, what part of this lump of cells is going to become a mouth, what part is going to become a tail, what part is going to become a butt, what part is going to become a heart. Okay. And so there's a lot of differentiation. There's folding in, there's dermal ridges, and all this different stuff going on. Implantation has to occur. Endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm has to develop, and different organs are derived from different groups of the endoderm, exoderm, and mesoderm. Okay, so the first 23 days is basically just organization and embryogenesis. The rest of the first trimester is focused on growth and organization and development. So like you have to develop the lungs, you have to develop the heart. A lot of these structures develop relatively early, but they aren't fully developed, right? So like even if a fetus has a heartbeat at week 8, it doesn't mean that it's viable, right? Viability is typically week 21, if I remember correctly. So we're still talking about very, very, very small little bitty babies. The second trimester, there's a lot of growth, but most of it is growth in length. So the organism is getting longer and longer, not so much bigger and bigger. Okay. In the third trimester, that's when things really start to get viable, right? The organs start to develop. They start to become more self-sustaining if necessary. The baby puts on mass. The third trimester is the largest gain of mass in the baby. Okay. Birth typically occurs at 40 weeks or 280 days, more or less. Neonates are considered 28 days of age. Basically, neonatals are just completely worthless. They cannot do much. They are completely dependent on their mother. They have very primitive reflexes, and that's about it. Their brain hasn't fully developed. At one point in time, I read somewhere in the textbook that human babies because of our upright posture, human babies are particularly worthless. They really can't do anything for themselves, right? And part of this is because our brains are so developed, so much more developed than primates, that we have to give birth earlier. Otherwise, it would not be possible for a fully developed fetus to be born. And to give you an idea of how extreme this is, if human babies were born at the same developmental stage as primate babies, pregnancy would last 22 months. And I told my girlfriend this, and she told me absolutely not. And that is completely understandable. 22 months seems like a really long time to be pregnant. Okay, so up until 22 months of age, the baby is pretty much worthless, right? The neonate is the first 28 days. They basically cry, eat, and poop. The infancy stage typically is defined from month 2 until the end of lactation, which is usually around 3 years of age. There's considerable variation in that, but it's usually around that time. Infancy is really rapid growth, milestones, teeth, cognition. There's something called sleep regression that occurs at month 4. And I find this absolutely fascinating. So it turns out that there's massive cognitive leaps that occur in month 4. And so, in month 2 and 3, the baby typically establishes a sleeping rhythm where they'll sleep, 6-7 hours through the night for the most part. And then right around month 4, that will oftentimes go away. And basically what happens is there's been so much neuron development that the baby doesn't want to sleep because they're like, hey, there's a whole world out here. Have you guys seen this? There's like trees and sticks and ceilings and stuff. And that's just an aspect of neural development. And then it typically goes away in a couple months. One of my friends just went through the sleep regression phase, which is kind of funny. If it's funny for me, it's not so funny for him. So childhood is typically the 3 to 7 year range. During this phase, there's moderate growth. They're still fully dependent on their parents. Permanent teeth will start showing up, and then their growth will start slowing at the end of 7 years. Childhood is the end of 7 years is defined as the end of childhood because prior to that, most children cannot live without their parents, right? And the way they found this out was they looked at how young of an orphan could survive out on the streets in like Charles Dickens' time, and they found that basically if they're less than 7 years of age, they wouldn't make it. But at 7, 8, 9, they started to be able to survive on the streets. Okay. So following 7 years of age, you have the juvenile time period. This is where it starts to get a little bit different for girls and boys, right? So for girls, it's 7 to 10. For boys, it's till about 12. And that's just because boys' puberty is later, okay? During this time period, growth is slowing. They start to feed themselves. There's great cognitive growth, but not nearly as much as the previous 7 years. So by the way, this is what 10-year-olds look like, in case you're curious, if you haven't seen a 10-year-old in a while. All right. So puberty. We're going to go into a lot of detail about puberty, right? So puberty is typically between the ages of 10 and 15 or 12 to 17. 10 to 15 for girls, 12 to 17 for boys, okay? And so basically what's going on is there's sex hormones start coursing at a higher level, and so that activates the previously organized neural networks. And what I mean by that is there's this concept called organization and activation, and this ties into human life history. Basically, your neural networks are developed in utero, but they're not activated until puberty, right? And like that rush of sex hormones is what activates those neural networks. And so that's why you start thinking differently around puberty. Okay, so we're going to go into this in much more detail. Puberty is super important. It's a transition to adulthood, rapid growth. Yeah. Interestingly enough, growth. So typically 25 to 27 centimeters in growth during puberty. This doesn't happen in other primates. This only happens in humans, this rapid growth spurt. So that indicates that it's probably a relatively recent evolutionary development, right? Sperm development begins early in males, much much prior to the full development of genitalia and hair. Um, Menstruation doesn't start in females till later, while breasts and pubic hair are nearly fully developed. So it's interesting that males produce gametes before the secondary sexual characteristics appear, whereas females will develop. They don't have fully functioning gametes until towards the end of the secondary sexual characteristics. Body composition changes. Females tend to accumulate more fat. Males have a tendency to increase muscle mass, but not as much body fat. The book goes a little bit in speculation. The book says muscle mass is to help males compete for mates, but it provides no citation for that. And like, I think they're oversimplifying human sexuality just a little bit in that one. The body fat helps with pregnancy and lactation, but the book doesn't provide a citation for that, but there's plenty of experimental evidence. Particularly female athletes that have really, really low body fat or anorexics will delay menarche, or they will skip periods if there's not enough body fat. So the body fat seems to be something that is necessary for normal female reproductive development. Okay, sorry, just had to turn my page. So like all of this is under endocrine control. And like I said, with the organization activation, there are sex steroids that are circulating during development that are organizing all this neural networks. But usually it's not activated until puberty when gametes start to go up. It's largely driven through testosterone and estrogen, and we're not getting into too much detail, but they stimulate slightly different cells because boys and girls have different parts. Testosterone stimulates something called Leydig cells, which then cause sperm production. Estrogen has this really complicated negative feedback loop with luteinizing hormone, which causes the final egg development and release, which we're not going to get into. Testosterone and estrogen are also responsible for the secondary sexual characteristics. Boys get pubic, facial, and axillary hair. Their larynx changes shape and becomes deeper. The phallus and scrotum grow, and they gain muscle mass. Females get breasts and pubic hair on the genitals and the axillary region, and this is like a really, really prolonged process. So the females will also experience a widening of their hips, which is to help with birth, right? But they won't reach the full pelvis size until like 4 years after menarche begins. Until the pelvis is fully developed, it's difficult for a mother to successfully give birth, to conceive and give birth. And that might be an evolutionary mechanism, or it might just be an aspect of the human condition. There's some interesting things that's going on with puberty that we're going to talk about a little bit later, right? So the timing of puberty, it's earlier in females and highly variable, right? For starters, there's just a lot of variability, right? It's dependent upon many different things. Nutrition is one of the things that it's dependent upon. And it used to be thought that it was body fat, like once the body reaches a certain percentage of fat, that's what triggered it, but that turns out to not be true. There's also influence of stress. We'll talk about that later. There's influence of stress in utero that has an impact on it, and there's also influence of stress during development itself, okay? Okay, so the timing of puberty onset in females is something that is it's heritable, right? So it's something that is responsive to evolutionary stresses. So it seems likely that the timing of puberty corresponds to the ability of both the mother and the fetus to survive, right? It would be very, very energetically expensive for a mother to have a baby if the baby can't make it, if she's not capable of supporting it until it gets old enough. Um, it's speculated. Um, it's not really known if puberty was earlier or later in Paleolithic people. You really just can't, like, how do you find that information out, right? Like, that's not really something that people know. Some people speculated it was later. Some people think that it was sooner. I don't really know. Um, the ability of a mother to raise a child is a little bit different now because we have social supports, right? And so there's a couple different things going on. The first of which is we have greater ability for grandparental care, right? So if there's a teen mom, typically the grandparents will help raise the baby, and that makes the odds of survival for the baby and for the teen mom much higher, right? So is that removing a selective pressure or not? Um, any way you look at it, the timing of puberty is probably controlled by multiple different genes and multiple different environmental cues, right? Um, you can take a look at twin studies. Twins that are raised in the same environment tend to have closer puberty than they do if they're raised in a different environment. But there's also things going on where uh, female hormonal cycles can sync up, so that could have something to do with it too. So it's kind of hard to tell what exactly is going on, but there's definitely multiple different genes influencing it. There's definitely multiple different environmental cues that are influencing it. So it's relatively common, but this is something that is under a selective pressure. What we do know is that puberty is starting to get earlier. Okay, so this graph to the right is, I pulled it off the internet, so it must be true. Norway apparently has really good records on when women start menarche, which is I don't know why, but whatever. Okay, we have the data, so we're going to look at it. And you can see that the average age has gotten lower and lower. It was 17 in the 1850s, right? And so we don't have as much data from the US, but I mean, it was 14 in around the 1900s, and it's fallen down to 13 or so now. This sentence right here, the decrease seems, I had you guys reread this. The decrease seems paradoxical given the concomitant fall in extrinsic mortality would be expected to ameliorate or reverse pubertal acceleration, since a better progression for survival should obviate the need for early reproduction. I want to pull out that passage because that could be one of the worst sentences I've ever read in the human language. It's excessively complicated, it's excessively wordy, and it's just not very clearly written. Yeah, but this is actually a fairly important sentence to understand. Um, Basically, what it's saying, because there's lower risk of extrinsic mortality, you think that you would want to delay puberty, right? And make sure that you're a large enough organism to support a fetus, right? Um, yeah, but I was thinking about this a little bit further. If you think about it, the decrease in extrinsic mortality is coupled with just better resource allocation, better resource availability, and better social controls overall. So I could see an evolutionary selective pressure towards earlier reproduction, given that survival rates are much more likely. So I can kind of see it both ways. The book is speculating quite a bit around this, and I'm hoping we can have a discussion in class about some of these different things. Is why is puberty starting earlier? And we don't really have an answer for this. Some people are pointing out that overall nutrition has gotten better. There's an interesting thing that the development of farming actually made nutrient availability more spotty and questionable. And the reason for that is if you are living in one area, right, and a famine occurs, a drought occurs, something like that. Sorry, my dog is drinking water right now. You're kind of stuck. Like if your crops fail, you're at a very high risk of starvation. this is true up until about the 1900s, and even less so now in the 1950s. In industrialized nations, the risk of famine is not very great at all, right? Largely because we have supply chains that can move food all around the world. It's very unlikely that there's a famine in every part of the world, although we'll see what happens with Ukraine coming forward, right? So there is better nutrition generally available today than there was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and 150 years ago, and that's gotten better and better. So that could be what's driving down the age of puberty, um, but it's hard to test that hypothesis, right? We also have better healthcare, so that might be what's driving it down too. Um, so COVID saw an increase in early puberty. There was an article that my sister sent to me in Time magazine that talked about this. And so I went in and I found the actual publication, and they noticed a significant increase in puberty in like 10-year-old girls, quite a bit younger than average. And they attributed this largely to stress. And so stress is kind of one of these really interesting things. The book makes the assumption, well, okay, so there's a couple things to keep in mind. First off, in utero stress or infant stress has a tendency to speed up puberty, right? So if an organism, like if a mother is stressed, then her female daughter can increase the timing of puberty by up to 18 months, which is quite a bit of a jump, right? And the idea is if the mother is stressed, if the infant is stressed, that means that there's probably a high risk of extrinsic mortality, or at least there was in our evolutionary history, which means your probably best life choice is to have reproduction as early as you can, because you might not get a chance to later. Childhood stress actually does the opposite usually, but not always. Whereas you have increased stress, then it usually delays puberty somewhat. Why it wasn't COVID, particularly, people attributed that mostly to stress. It was a very stressful situation, but it also could have been just like more sedentary lifestyle. There could have been screens going on. It's also possible that endocrine disrupting chemicals are what's causing puberty to start getting earlier overall. As it turns out, we produce a wide variety of chemicals that can actually mimic steroids. The one I'm most familiar with is a compound called nonylphenol, which can actually imitate estrogen. There was a lot of news about nonylphenol when I was in college. I actually ended up doing a little bit of undergraduate research on it. It was a soap that industries use, and it's been found to actually feminize fish in wastewater treatment plants. So like fish are pretty small, so they're very susceptible to these, but humans are also experiencing this. So maybe there's a lot of different chemicals in our water system that are causing puberty to occur earlier. One thing to consider is birth control. Women who take birth control urinate higher levels of estrogen, and so then that will actually go into the wastewater treatment and re-enter our water supply. So like, it's possible that we're just consuming more estrogen than we ever did before, depending upon the persistence of these molecules, where you get your water supply from. It's really, really, like, I'm kind of speculating off my ass right now, but it's kind of complicated. It's something to consider. Like, there is a possibility that there are endocrine disrupting chemicals in the environment that are causing puberty to occur earlier, right? Book basically makes the argument that because of the decreased risk of extrinsic mortality, we should see delayed puberty, but it's actually moving in the opposite direction. And the book doesn't really seem to have an answer for this, and I don't either, and neither do scientists overall. one thing that I tend to think about whenever I see things moving in the opposite direction is we have this concept where we assume everything is a linear relationship, right? Like that's just kind of like our default setting, but it doesn't have to be a linear relationship. It could also be a V-shaped relationship, right? So if you consider environmental, like extrinsic mortality over here, right? Over here, this is high extrinsic mortality. Over here, this is low extrinsic mortality. And here we're graphing the age of puberty, right? So if extrinsic mortality is really high, then you want to increase the age of puberty, right? And as it goes down, it gets lower and lower and lower. But if extrinsic mortality is extremely low, then maybe because nutrient availability is so good, parental support is around, why not have a kid early, right? And that might increase your reproductive fitness overall. So I have no evidence to support my claim, but I don't think the book does either. Um, so these are just two different ways I think you could think about it. And to be honest, we don't know what's true. We don't know what's causing this. But these are things that you can consider. Okay, so following puberty is a period called adolescence. The book defines adolescence. Typically, we think of adolescence as like 12 to 17. The book actually says it starts 5 to 8 years after puberty. 5 years for girls, 8 years for boys. It's not clear if that's the onset of puberty or the stopping of puberty, but I basically put it in the 20 to 25 age range. And the reason why I did that is because I want to point out that, 20-year-olds are still developing, okay? Um, full cognitive development doesn't happen in males until they're like 25, 26 years old. It doesn't happen in females till they're like 21 or 22 years old. Full physiological development in women is right around 24, if I remember correctly. That's when the last epiphyseal growth plate seals in the clavicle. And for boys, it's not till like 28, right? So like 20-year-olds are still developing, okay? And so the end of adolescence is marked by a final growth spurt. Men will put on more muscle mass. Women put on a little bit more body fat, gain a little bit more height. And so there is a final growth spurt that occurs right around 20 years of age. Okay. Adolescence, yeah. Basically, adolescence is the acclimation between puberty, the onset of puberty, or the ending of puberty, and full adulthood, right? And so by the end of adolescence, they should be integrated into the workforce, integrated into social structures, and like college students are very much going through this. It has been argued that while puberty has gotten earlier, adolescence has been extended, right? So like a fully grown kid in the 1900s was like 20, right? Whereas a lot of people don't feel like they're truly an adult till like 27, 28 years of age. Okay. Adulthood is basically from age 20-ish until the end of childbearing, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's a really, really prolonged period. It's basically, there's not a lot of developmental changes. It's basically focused on homeostasis, right? So your physiology, your behavior, your cognition. Basically, you're trying to maintain things at the same level throughout the time period. Menopause typically hits by age 50, and that typically is the end of adulthood and then moving into old age, right? For men, there's no clear cutoff. Like it's not like at age 50 they stop producing sperm, but in reality, they probably follow women in terms of like end of adulthood, old age. So 50 is generally considered the start of old age. And then, yeah, old age. Old age is basically the end of childbearing years until death. It's marked by a decline in function of many tissues and just kind of the end of childbearing. Yeah. We pointed out earlier that senescence isn't the same thing. Aging is a progressive decline where senescence occurs throughout the lifespan, right? So, yeah. But why do we get old? this is something that scientists really don't know. There's a couple different hypotheses floating around. The first off is like after you've reproduced, there's really no reason for your body to maintain itself, right? Like you've already reproduced, you've put all your energy into producing gametes. The gametes are out there in the world. Hopefully they are children themselves and like going and doing children things and growing and developing, and like that's your reproductive cycle. You've reproduced, so why put energy into maintaining reproduction? This concept antagonistic pleiotropy, genes that increase fitness in your 20s could also be the genes that cause you to get old and die later, right? So like testosterone has been shown to testosterone can it increases muscle mass, but it can also increase like cancer rates. Same with estrogen, right? So like the genes to produce them may be advantageous during your reproductive years, but they're a problem when you're older. And the last is disposable soma theory, which basically focuses on during your reproductive years, you basically sacrifice, your emphasis is on reproduction, your gamete production. And so you're very slowly sacrificing energy allocation that could go towards your gametes, or could go towards your soma, towards gametes, and eventually your body just breaks down and dies. Regardless, old age seems to be written into our biological code in very interesting ways that we will talk about, particularly when we talk about cancer, because cancer cells are immortal. There are some interesting animals that don't seem to have that written in their environmental or in their genetic code, like koi. Apparently koi are immortal. And every time I say that, I'm like, that can't be right. And I look it up and it's basically true. So maybe we'll talk about that in class. But yeah, you get old and you die. It's just an aspect of life. Hey, yeah, so I wanted to make sure my slides were right. I think this is actually how I want to do it. So if you're looking for selective pressure, is a good way to do it is look at distinct features of human growth and see why they're different and how they're different. There's a couple different terms we should know. Heterochromy is the timing of an appearance of a trait is changed during development. Neoteny is a slowing down the rate of development, and hypermorphous is a prolonged development that leads to magnification of the trait. So an example of hypermorphous would be our brains, right? So like brain development continues in humans much longer than it does in other primates, and this is because we've had a positive selection for intelligence, right? Neoteny is interesting because it can cause to the retention of juvenile traits into adulthood, right? So we have a relatively small jaw and a relatively flat face, and that could be the result of neoteny. Although that could be a selective pressure, like those who were selectively selected for, possibly through sexual selection, would be my speculation. But we do also have a prolonged childhood phase, which is another example of neoteny, right? And this is an aspect of our overall development. It's a result of bipedalism and our big frickin' heads, okay? The puberty growth spurt is something that's not seen in other primates, and so that means it likely evolved in the hominid line exclusively, and so there must be some selective pressure for that growth spurt to occur, right? Like why? The last thing that's really unique is menopause, right? So like this menopause and reproductive decline isn't seen in other animals. So why does it occur in humans? So one of the theories is that there's just lack of selective pressure to continue to have reproduction. The book says basically it's likely that few females live past 50s in prehistoric times. So there was just no pressure to maintain that reproduction. Prehistoric, and it hasn't evolved. I mean, I can see that being an argument, but you would think that some reproduction is better than no reproduction, right? The authors, as their own counter argument, point out that many women did live in their 70s, 80s, even in prehistoric times, right? So that represents 10 to 15 years of foregone reproductive success. And males also don't see a similar decline, right? Like males can have babies well into the 70s and 80s. So why does it happen in females, but it doesn't happen in men? Okay. There's two theories for why menopause occurs. The first of which is it gives a fitness advantage, because then grandma can help raise her grandkids, right? So like that's called the grandmother hypothesis, and we've alluded to that a little bit earlier. But basically, if you have a second caregiver around, that can increase her children's reproductive fitness, which therefore increases her reproductive fitness. And there's some evidence to support that. Just basically, when you look at human patterns of behavior, there's a saying. It seemed, at least in my experience, mothers and daughters tend to have a close social bond than fathers and sons do. It just seems like you get adopted into a family as a guy. I mean, that's based on my limited experience, but I've also talked to other guys who have seen similar experiences too. And it definitely goes the other way too. So that's not great evidence, but it's consistent with at least my experience. The other one is that the reproductive decline allows her to make sure that her youngest child makes it to adulthood, right? So if, she's 45 years old, has a baby, that's, 18 years of parental care, you're talking 63. So you want to make sure that that youngest child can make it to adulthood before passing away. The thing I'd like to point out about those two different theories is that they're not mutually exclusive. They could both be true. Okay. The book never mentions that there's an increased risk in mortality with geriatric pregnancies, both for the mother and the fetus. And so those are selective pressures that can actually work with the two theories that I discussed previously. So it's likely a combination of multiple different things. The other thing that's interesting is it could just be an aspect of our prolonged life, like we live much longer than perhaps we were supposed to. And the evidence for this comes from primates that are kept in zoos tend to live longer lives, and they will actually undergo a menopause. So it could just be that we've extended our lives so long that the females run out of eggs to release, or something to that effect. All right. Oh, sorry. All right, so evolution of novelty. The book doesn't go into much detail about this, so I did a little bit more digging. In general, your body needs to have a plan, right? Like the first thing your body does is establishes polarity, a head and a tail, right? Like a anterior and a posterior. And then from there, it develops segmentation, right? And then those different segmentations can develop different structures and organs. And there's a group of genes known as Hox genes, which stands for homeobox genes, that are largely responsible for this body plan, right? And they're largely transcription factors that activate various other genes, right? So like the different Hox genes activate a suite of genes that activate a bunch of other genes. And so what's interesting is these genes are actually highly conserved, right? So you can find homologs in different species that correspond. And there's been duplication events in humans. Our Hox genes are spread across 4 different chromosomes, which is kind of interesting. They're on 6, 11, 15, and 2. Okay. And they help establish your general overall body plan, right? Like that's the function of them. Interesting thing about Hox genes is if you start messing with Hox genes, it produces really, really rapid changes. So this is stuff that was done in the lab, right? So basically what they did was they activated a Hox gene right here that caused these halteres, which are reproductive structures, if I remember correctly, to develop into wings, right? So now you have a 4-winged fruit fly, okay? Here they activated a Hox gene for a leg, where it should be in the antenna, and now you have legs where there were antennae, right? So like by changing these Hox genes, you can produce very, very, very rapid changes in organisms in a very short period of time. And I'd like you to consider for a second insects and spiders and crabs, right? 6 legs, 8 legs, 10 limbs. 10 limbs because pincers, right? And so basically, if you think about it, how do you go from a 6-legged organism to an 8-legged organism to a 10-legged organism? And it seems at least somewhat likely by activating different numbers of Hox genes, you can get different numbers of limbs. Now, I did a little bit of digging into this, and there's a lot of different differences in Hox gene regulation that occurs in spiders, insects, and crabs. But it does seem that that's what drove their evolution, was the change in activation of Hox genes. Um, the last thing I want to point out is this concept of collinear. Not the last thing, actually, there's one more slide after this. Collinearity. So the interesting thing about Hox genes is if you look at their order on the chromosome, they're the same order they are on the body, right? So like pink corresponds to the most anterior aspect, right, in both humans and fruit flies. Orange corresponds to like this aspect right here. You can see yellow is just posterior to that. So they're in the same order on the chromosome that they are on the body, which is really, 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 really strange. And I don't understand why. Like, genes can appear in any order. You can activate a gene in any aspect of the chromosome based upon where it sits. So like, why are they all in one order? And I've never gotten a satisfactory answer for it, but it seems like too much of a coincidence that all the Hox genes are in the same order that they're expressed on the body, and there's no reason for it. Like that doesn't seem right to me. Last thing I want to point out, this is Sebastian the crab, and it has been pointed out to me that Sebastian the crab is most likely not a crab. He is most likely, in fact, a modified turtle. Okay? And so if you look at his shell, right, you can see it has a turtle-like appearance. Okay? Now, if you think about a turtle shell is actually caused by its vertebrae coming out and going around, right? So in order to get from an insect to having a turtle-like shell, it has to involve internal bones instead of an exoskeleton, and then it has to evolve it to come out, which is a huge, huge, huge morphological change. But for a turtle to develop 2 extra limbs and pincers is actually relatively easy. All you have to do is duplicate a couple Hox genes, and then modify the structure based on claspers. And as we said, crabs are the ideal aquatic morph. So that's something for you to think about the next time you watch Little Mermaid. It seems to me that Sebastian the crab is in fact a turtle and not a crab. And I want to give credit to Professor Wolschlager, who was the person who pointed this out to me.